Good morning. Today I have joining me Garrick Taylor with the Arizona Chamber of Commerce. Garrick, thank you so much for joining us here today for our public policy series.
Terry, thanks for having me. These are unusual times, but it's great to see you at least through the power of Zoom.
Absolutely. So what has the Arizona Chamber been up to?
Yeah. When this invitation was first extended for me to speak to your group, we were going to have a nice conversation about Arizona and cross-border trade. We could still have that conversation, but the last month, like for every Chamber of Commerce, we are doing our best to help them navigate this very unusual time. It's not only a pandemic, but it's involved office shutdowns, work closures, layoffs and furloughs. So we're helping members access things just like you, like the Paycheck Protection Program, EIDL loans, helping workers navigate the sometimes complicated unemployment system, and now beginning to think, thankfully, about what reopening looks like. And I'm sure that's something you're spending a lot of time thinking about as well.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I want to talk about, because yes, we are navigating this whole component, but I know that the legislature passed a skinny budget, and we know that.
Right.
What is this going to look like? I mean, we're just about through our reserves, and now there's talk that they're probably not going back into session. And so what's next for us down at the Capitol?
Yeah, you've probably heard this from the legislative guests that you've had on, but let's take this in order. Bills that had begun in one chamber of the legislature had crossed over to the opposite chamber. They were beginning to be heard. Bills were beginning to be heard before this shutdown happened. The legislature decided to pass a fiscal year 2021 budget. Now, the state's fiscal year begins July 1, but in Arizona, because of the legislature's action, we already have a spending plan in place. Now, that's important because legislatures around the country were dealing with this same issue. What do? Do we stay in session? Do we pass a budget? We had a conversation at the Arizona Chamber with Sean Bowie, who represents Chandler as well. And he talked about visiting with colleagues around the country who had not passed a budget. And now they're wondering, how do they get back into session and do that? So kudos to the legislature for at least putting a basic spending plan in place for fiscal year 21. All right, so now the next question is, well, when do you go back if you need to adjust to new revenue numbers, to adopt COVID-19 related policies, or three, pass any other policies that the legislature might deem important? The plan was to recess at the sound of the gavel. All that means is they weren't officially adjourned, they were simply pressing pause. Well, that date to go back in was in mid-April, which, Terry, I don't know about you, the way the calendar works these days, that might have well been a year ago, mid-April.
Exactly.
So they obviously they did not come back in. It was not deemed safe to do so. What they did, though, is leadership extended the session to May 1. And as you and I have this conversation, that's a week from today. Just earlier this week, to give you a sense of how quickly things change, was that the legislature would go back in a very limited form and sine die, which is the fancy term for without a day. They would officially end the session, anticipating that sometime in the next several months, they would come back in a special session to deal with some of the issues you and I just talked about. Well, there seems to be some conversation within the respective caucuses that, no, let's just continue to press pause and we can leave the session open. So as of today, again, things change. I don't anticipate that they'll be back on May 1. They will be back eventually. I would imagine they're going to have to adjust some spending plans based on what unfortunately will probably be a downturn in revenues, and then also some COVID-related policies. I wish I could give you the date to mark on your calendar, but as you know, it's impossible to predict anything right now.
And sometimes it changes hour by hour.
It does.
Nobody has a crystal ball in this situation.
Yep.
So let's talk about, because the Arizona Chamber has been also very involved at the federal level as well. Can you talk about some of those things that you're still continuing to work on that are still really relevant?
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that. Before this happened, we had a robust federal agenda, regularly checking in with the state's congressional delegation, just like you do at your chamber. There are all sorts of things that are important to job creators to help them grow their businesses and grow this economy, which you might remember had a very low employment rate and very robust growth just about 45 days ago. So when the pandemic happened, we immediately shifted into communicating with our delegation about what are we going to do for relief for these businesses, small and large. And I know the membership of your chamber is especially sensitive to those issues. We were strong supporters of these various relief packages, including the third relief package, also known as the CARES Act. As you know, the CARES Act had the Paycheck Protection Program in it, the expanded EIDL program with the $10,000 emergency grant. These relief packages also included the enhanced unemployment. The Arizona Chamber supported all of those and communicated as much to the delegation. Like you, we've also been hosting regular conference calls and video calls with members of our delegation. We've talked to just about every member of the House delegation, still working our way through that, but we've had regular access to Senator Sinema and Senator McSally. Credit to both of them. I don't know what your experience has been, but from our end, they've been extremely accessible, willing to calls with us or you name it, visit with our board of directors, committees. They've been extremely accessible. We've been very appreciative of that.
We've had that same experience.
Absolutely, yeah. We've been just as disappointed as any business advocacy group in some of the time it's taken for Congress to act on these really emergency measures. But when it comes to our delegation, we've been extremely pleased with the alacrity that they've been acting with.
Well, and it's interesting. I know that one of the things that we've noticed with especially our delegation and even on the House side with CD5 and 9 with Congressman Biggs and Congressman Stanton.
Yeah.
I would really say our representatives, they've really been crossing party lines just to get this done and been very, very open to our comments and so forth.
I agree with you, Terry. Look, on a policy level, we know that they're not going to be in lockstep agreement with one another. But when it comes to a regular engagement, like with your membership or the Arizona Chamber's membership, very accessible. It's really appreciated.
Absolutely. So one of the other things that I know that you have been very involved on the, I guess it's every other day conference calls with the governor's office and with the Commerce Authority. You guys have been really leaders in that. On what we look like, what are our next steps? How do we open up? You're kind of that voice for all of us, even though we've been invited to the table and they're really listening. But talk a little bit about some of those things that you've taken that leadership role on.
Yeah, it's an important question because before you know it, we're going to be reopening. Now, it might be in a phased approach. The governor in his press conference the other day said at his discretion, some of these reopening measures could be on a statewide basis. Some could be on county by county. It said it's his preference that it's statewide, but that may not be possible. We might have to phase this in regionally. As you said, there is an intense conversation going on within the governor's team about what a reopening strategy might look like. Sandra Watson, who leads the Arizona Commerce Authority, is leading that effort. She's working closely with Debbie Johnson, who heads up the Office of Tourism. As you know, it's a sector that's been walloped in the last month and a half as a result of this pandemic. Here's some ray of hope, Terry. I think that the news from the governor's office that when the stay-at-home order expires on April 30, that we will begin to see reopening of elective medical procedures. That's a little ray of hope. And just to be clear, when we say elective, we don't mean unimportant. We're talking things like knee replacements and heart valves and cancer screenings, things like that. Yes, you might be able to put it off, but it doesn't mean it's unimportant. You also know that's a major revenue generator for our healthcare providers who are in this very odd scenario right now, where they are probably some of the most important economic sector in our economy right now, and yet they're also facing furloughs and layoffs in their own sector. So it's very odd. We need to reset that, allow them to get back to a point where they can see patients. Now, what does it look like beyond that? The governor in his last press conference said that it could mean simply extending the stay-at-home order. It could mean letting it expire, or it could mean extending with modifications based on data that we have today. Now, I'm not going to speculate because, as you and I just said, it's changing by the hour. But the move to elective medical procedures is a positive one. Might be a small step for some, but it's an important one. Then I think we'll begin to look at things like restaurant and theater capacity, small businesses, for example, that maybe never have large numbers of people gathering in one place. Maybe small retail that maybe has a steady flow, but people aren't packed in. Now, let's project out some months, a reopening for a small boutique store and a concert venue. Well, those reopening strategies might be completely different. And I think it's important, whether it's groups like the one I represent or the one you represent, that we are in communication with them. And I don't know about you, Terri, but I think our members can reopen or find a way to reopen in a responsible, safe way that protects their customers and their employees.
And I would agree with that. And I was very pleased to hear the executive order the other day. I have 2 family members that are here visiting from Michigan, and we're supposed to go back to Michigan and could not due to the circumstances. They come out every year. Since one of those family members is here, she has to go in for a valve, potentially a valve, a stent replacement.
Yep.
So with that being said, she's been put on hold. And so for me personally, I was very pleased to see that, because, you're right, that going in for a stent is not I don't see as an elective surgery. It's a necessary surgery.
That's right.
So as we continue to move forward, I will say one of the biggest positives that we are really hearing from our members is, and we all have those success stories in our community, and some of our companies here in Chandler have really kind of already pivoted and diversified what their business model is. And I'm really pleased to see some of that, because we're going to see some companies really coming out of this stronger than they were. Stronger in the sense of that diversification. And I think that that's important as we continue to move forward. Not only that, I think that we're such a global community here in Chandler. When you take a look at our top companies, what we have here, and it doesn't just happen, it doesn't affect just Chandler, it affects us worldwide. And we're really going to have to take a look at that as Arizona as we move forward as well.
Yeah, okay, good news, bad news. This has had a tremendous negative effect on the global economy. We get it. Arizona, Chandler entered this economic downturn in an extremely strong position. You probably have a better handle on city finances than I, but at a state level, Terri, let's remember, we went in with nearly $1 billion in cash and $1 billion in the rainy day. Look, the governor took a lot of arrows for some who believe that that was too big of a reserve fund, that some of that should be either have been spent or returned to taxpayers. Boy, hindsight 2020, but thank goodness that reserve fund to draw upon. Now, I get it, in state government, $1 billion can go like that, but I don't know about you. I'm glad that we had it versus you and I having this conversation about where are we going to dig this cash up out of the couch cushions.
So the Arizona Chamber was very involved in especially with your relationships with the Arizona-Mexico Commission and trade in general, USMCA, that was a critical component. As we come out of this, what are some of the plans or what are some of the things that you're doing to help to continue to keep those borders open?
Yeah, let's think
Safely.
about where we are right now. We thought, again, pre-pandemic, that we would be celebrating the implementation of USMCA, the successor agreement to NAFTA, on June 1. Well, that's not going to happen now. The earliest it could be implemented is July 1, and you are hearing from manufacturers throughout the North American supply chain, especially in the auto sector, that they would rather see that implementation date pushed out even farther because they're dealing with a spot fire right now on the pandemic. They don't have the ability right now to do some of these customs procedures to get themselves ready for an early implementation date. But to your point, pandemic or no pandemic, we have to make sure that we are keeping supply lines flowing. You talked about the fact about how interconnected the members of the Chandler Chamber are. Some of the large employers in Chandler are depending on inputs from outside the borders of Arizona and sometimes from outside the borders of the United States. Thankfully, the Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection have kept those commercial lanes flowing at Arizona ports of entry and at all U.S. ports of entry. Now, if you and I wanted to go down and do some cross-border tourism, there are travel restrictions for that. But for commercial traffic, everything is continuing to flow as per usual, and we would continue to communicate that to the administration. That needs to remain the case. A lot of things that you and I are depending on right now, like basic things like fruits and vegetables, well, where do they come from? They come from outside the country. Now let's get on the other side of this pandemic and think about what a world might look like once USMCA is fully implemented. Arizona is really well positioned. Not only are we a border state, but we have an already attractive business environment in a zero tariff environment. And with manufacturers, I don't know if you were hearing this, but with manufacturers beginning to think about bringing supply chains home rather than abroad, Arizona could be really well positioned to grow the already over 200,000 jobs that are accounted for trade with Canada and Mexico. So I'm not trying to shine you on here, but when we get on the other side of this pandemic and get into regular programming with international trade, Arizona could be in a really good position.
It's interesting. I had a conversation earlier in the week. Well, we're in daily conversations, but with our economic development department. And I know that you've been in contact with GPAC and the Commerce Authority and so forth. People are still looking at Arizona. That those discussions are still continuing, which I think is very positive.
Thank goodness, Terry, because I that jives with what we're hearing. Is that not just talking to people in that world, and they'll tell you that they have not had prospects fall out of the pipeline. They're still there. They're still interested. Are you hearing optimism from within your city level economic developers?
We are. Obviously, we're still the ones that are here right now and so forth. There are many, many that are hurting right now. And we are navigating that on what those, just as you are, on how to help those that are in our own backyard right now. And we will get through this, and we will recover. So,
Terry, one of the things that you hear in a Chamber of Commerce a lot, and it's not without good reason, from existing businesses, what are you doing for me? I hear you talking about attracting businesses all the time, but I've been here for the last 2 decades. What are you doing for me? These are fair criticisms. We deal with this all the time. And I think dealing with this economic downturn, this is where we really respond to existing businesses, making sure they have access to the relief that they deserve. And we've got to walk and chew gum and make sure that economic development pipeline stays full.
Well, and that's one of the things that we're really listening. Not that we weren't listening before, but we're really, okay, tell us what your pain points are. How do we help you move through this? So for instance, we worked closely with economic development, and our city came up right off the bat and release some of the restrictions on sign ordinances and so forth, so that they could put up banners that said we're open, or drive through, or curbside service, whatever those case may be.
Yep.
Easing some of the restrictions on for building and not to put safety in any jeopardy, but really working, and economic development did a great job of working with the inner city departments on how do we make this more business friendly immediately for people right now.
Okay,
and they did a fabulous job.
Yeah, that's
So,
what we're doing.
yeah. Well, Garrett, what else should we be really kind of keeping on our forefront as we continue to roll out of this?
Yeah, thinking about what the reopening strategy looks like here in Arizona, but when you look to a federal level, the House, the U.S. House, just followed up on the action of the U.S. Senate and finally injected billions more back into the Paycheck Protection Program. Terri, don't be surprised if Congress needs to go back in again and put more dollars into that program. I don't think we want to get into a scenario where a business that needs help, needs actual relief, can't get it simply because the funds have been exhausted. If a business has been harmed by this pandemic and meets the criteria and can preserve its payroll, let's get them the relief that they need. We don't want to get into a first come, first served until the money's all gone. We want to make sure that businesses get the relief that they need. And, Terri, you and I have probably come up with a different small business relief plan, but this is the one we've got. And the good news about it is that it's based on the premise that you preserve your pay, you keep your employees connected to the employer. So let's, if we need to inject more funds into the program, let's do so. Let's lift some of these restrictions on bankers. It's making it more difficult for them to release the funds to customers. And Terri, for groups like the Arizona Chamber or the Chandler Chamber or any business advocacy group, let's continue to educate our members about the need to contact their lender, do things like open an account in the business's name for those funds. If they're applying for EIDL loans, to work with their SBA approved lender. All we can do, I shouldn't say all, but much of what we can do is just helping communicate some of these options to businesses, whether it's somebody who's a member of the Chandler Chamber or the Arizona Chamber. No business should be irreparably harmed by a pandemic that has come on through no fault of the businesses. The bad guy here is not in the business sector or the Main Street business. They've been harmed. We can get them the relief, and we should do so.
Well, and I know that we've all been collaboratively working on that. And I know that I've had preliminary discussions with all of our federal delegation on what CARES 2.0 may look like, if we can get that off. So, and I know we've had several conversations early on in conjunction with economic development. We hosted, when the governor came out with his executive order on the evictions for businesses.
Right.
And so we had 2 different meetings with several of our key landlords, and from different industry sectors. So we had some from office, we had, medical, we had the industrial side, and really kind of taking a look at that. We've had 2 different conversations with them. Yeah. Really great input, because again, even though some of them may wanted to work with their individuals and not harm those businesses, really help them, right. Their hands were tied through their bankers and their investors as well. And so we really took a hard look at that and just opening up those conversations so that they could also hear that they weren't the only ones in this too.
Terri, I mean, I don't know about you, but that's been one of the most complicated issues here. And I know it puts people like you in a difficult spot because there are no easy answers there from the tenant's perspective and from the landlord's perspective, right. Who has bills to pay on the financing. If there were easy answers for this, you and I would be making millions right now. These are very tough issues that business groups and our members are facing right now.
Well, and I know that, so granted, we represent that business community as well, but, we've also had these discussions also with our schools and with the education. And I know that you and Glenn have had several conversations with Superintendent Hoffman, with our charter schools. I watched one of those, your virtual happy hours on that.
Yeah.
Those are all key critical issues as we move forward, to help collaborate and really intertwine all of us together so that we're moving forward.
Yeah, it's incredibly, you have to take a holistic approach to these things. We're incredibly interconnected. If this were, because of the way this pandemic fell on the calendar, you can imagine though, some of the challenges, it's May, if people were start to go back to work, schools are not going to be open, Terri, and we're going to have to think about just basic things like that. These are some real tough, challenging questions. I'm sure that relying on the input of our members and communicating that to decision makers, we're going to be able to arrive at some satisfactory conclusions.
Yeah. Well, I just want to again do a shout out. We really appreciate and value our relationship with the Arizona Chamber and everything that you're doing. We really look to you also as leaders, and then how to take what that message is and also implement it in our local communities. So I just want to thank you for your leadership and continued, and really helping to navigate this from the top level down on down.
Terri, thanks for the invitation and thanks for everything you're doing. I love working with the Chandler Chamber. Keep creating jobs in Chandler, and we know that we're going to get on the other side of this pandemic stronger. So thanks again.
Great. Thank you for joining us.